Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first part of your lecture. We are talking about race and racism. After we finish with race and racism, we're going to move into media. So really this lecture and this module this week covers some pretty significant topics around what is impacting our children and their socialization. We're going to look at this from a historical perspective first, because we know that history still impacts us to this day, especially around these issues. So let's go ahead and jump on in. The first thing I really want to touch on for you guys is the idea that a lot of times we use vocabulary interchangeably, and when we do that, it helps us define our thinking about things. And so if we're using skin color and race and ethnicity interchangeably, then we're getting it wrong, because these things are all very separate ideas and thoughts. So skin color is just the pigmentation in your skin, how much pigmentation you have, right? And because of your pigmentation, that comes from historically your migration, adaptations, just kind of meeting the need based on geographically where you lived. That is something completely different than the race. Race is related to skin color in the sense that skin color has been weaponized and utilized as a tool to define and categorize people in order to create a system of oppression and privilege. So it's an idea that society has assigned meaning to the skin color that you have. And when you assign meaning to something like that, historically we've seen in our country, that meaning and value can change over time, and you can change the definition of it. And that's why it's a social construct. Separate from race completely is ethnicity, and that has to do with your culture, your ancestry, and your heritage. And when you have an ethnicity, the ethnic groups typically have a ritual, customs, traditions, and ceremonies that they partake in. Well, all three things very different. And thinking and talking about them as they're interchangeable is a disservice to our understanding and a disservice to our ability to serve families and children without bias. All right, and let's move forward and talk a little bit more about race. Before we jump into this slide and I show you what I'd like to talk to you about, I want to say what this is about. This slide really is about how race as a social construct has evolved over time in our country. Now, this slide is going to touch on some components that assign value to race. It is not a slide intended to encompass all of the racism that has occurred in this country or in the world. Really, it is to show you how the idea of race as a social construct can evolve over time and how we can attach value to that social construct to create that oppression and privilege like I mentioned before. Okay, so just keeping in mind, it's really supposed to be an overview to get an idea of how social constructs can be redefined over time to meet the needs of society at that point in time. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and jump in. What I want to share with you first is the idea that in 1790, race was part of the census for the first time. This idea that we're going to start categorizing people based on the color of their skin. Shortly after that, in the 18th century, we had three categories. There was white, other persons, and slaves. And other persons really was anybody who was Native American, although at that time period, they would have been referred to as Indians, or maybe free slaves, things of that nature. All right, moving forward into the early 1900s, we had the scientific race theory come about. And what the scientific race theory is about is the idea that there is some kind of biology or predisposed abilities attached to your skin color. So they would say that depending on your skin color, you may be smarter than others. Depending on your skin color, you might be healthier than other people. Depending on your skin color, you might have better athletic ability than other people. And of course, we know this to be completely false at this time period because we know that race is not attached to biology at all. All right, but you could see how if you believed certain groups of people were meant to be unhealthy or less healthy than you could justify giving them less services. If you felt like a group of people are not going to be as capable of learning as other groups, you wouldn't give them as much schooling, and then you'd perpetuate that cycle. Okay, so again, when you assign value to race and create a social construct, you're creating a situation where there's less access. All right, moving forward, let's talk about what happens next. And again, this is just a representation of how you assign a value. You have consequences to assigning value. In 1890 to 1920, 2,500 Blacks were lynched in the South. And why this doesn't have anything to do with the social construct as far as how we're defining race, it does give you a sense of the value we assign to race. So at this point in time, when you're lynching someone and that is acceptable, you can see that as a representation of how much value is assigned to their lives. Not very much. They're really thought of as not being equals, right? Or even really worth worrying about, I would say. All right, moving on to the early 1900s. States were designating Blacks differently depending on how much Black heritage they had. So in Florida, if you had anybody that was qualified or defined in your family as Black, that one eighth of your ancestry was defined as Black, you were also defined as Black. In Virginia, if you had 1/16 of your ancestry defined as Black, you were also defined as Black. Now in Alabama at this time period, if you had anybody in your ancestry that was defined as Black, you were also defined as Black. So I just want you to take a moment and consider what it would be like to have different rights, right? Because race gets assigned a value, which means you get treated differently and you get different access. So at this point in time, you could cross state lines and have different rights and different values depending on the color of your skin, depending on your ancestry. Now, we do have some of that happening in our country right now with state laws, right? You have different rights depending on where you're at. But just think for a minute what that would be like to cross state lines depending on how you were viewed and the attachment they had to that, the value that was attached to it. All right, moving on. In 1922, just to preface this, at this point in time, if you wanted to become a naturalized citizen of the United States of America, you had to be defined as white. So in 1922, Ozawa was a Japanese man who was trying to become a naturalized citizen. However, the Supreme Court said, I'm sorry, you are not white because you are not Caucasian, so you cannot be a U.S. citizen. Shortly after that, in 1923, an Indian man with the last name Find made the argument that he did qualify as a Caucasian and therefore he could become a naturalized citizen. At that point in time, the Supreme Court changed their argument and said, I'm sorry, white is not actually a scientific idea. You can't really measure it. It's something just kind of the common man knows. I know it when I see it. So imagine that. Imagine somebody telling you that you could qualify or not qualify just based on their own judgment and their own feelings. That's what was happening at this point in time. All right, in 1942, again, going back to that place of understanding how when we categorize people and we assign value to their race, we're able to deny them access and create that oppression and privilege. A great example of that is in 1942 with the Japanese internment camps. Because we assigned value to their race and created a social construct around being Japanese, we were able to place massive groups of people in internment camps, and nobody thought anything of it. Well, maybe a lot of people did, but we were able to do it. In 1952, we see the racial requirement to become a naturalized citizen finally dropped. The idea is that you could become a naturalized citizen of this country and you did not have to be defined as white. That's pretty significant. 1952, I know that feels like a long time ago. It's really not that long ago. So just keeping in mind that it took us a long time to get there and it really wasn't that long ago from where we're at now. All right, and the last thing I want to talk to you about, just kind of getting an idea around race, is in 1967, there was Loving versus Virginia. And this was the first time that there was interracial marriage allowed. The idea that we could actually blend what we classified as races, and that was going to be acceptable. Okay. Again, it gets to the idea of how much value we assign to race. The idea that we wouldn't even allow people to marry because we had assigned them different races. And our thinking was different races had different qualities or different abilities, and therefore mixing them would not be a positive thing to do. Okay. All right, moving forward a little bit, I want to talk to you about racial identity. There are different racial identities. The first one is American Indian Alaska Native. That's a person from North America who identifies culturally with tribal affiliation or community. We have Asian or Pacific Islander, the origins of Far East, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, or Pacific Islands. We have Blacks, who origins of Black racial groups in Africa. Hispanics are origins from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central America, South America, and Spanish culture. And then we have white, origins from Europe, North Africa, and Middle East. All right, just kind of for you to know. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this lecture before I let you take a break are minority groups and what it means to be a minority. You don't have to be the least amount of people in the room to be a minority. In order to be a minority, what it means is that you don't have the same access or privilege, you're being provided different treatment, and you're facing discrimination because you are being oppressed. You would lack that social power in order to make change and actually have a say in what's happening. Typically, when this happens, your cultural and your traits are looked down upon by the dominant group. And the existence of these minority groups is what fosters privilege, right? The idea that if you can oppress certain groups, then you can provide privilege to others. And just to keep in mind, to be a minority, it doesn't have to be by race. It could be by age, gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, religious beliefs, and socioeconomic status. Any one of those groups can be a minority because they lack social power and they're treated differently and they're looked down upon. And by oppressing them, you're creating privilege. All right. So again, it doesn't have to be race. It is race a lot of times, but it can be other things as well. All right. With that, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back and talk about different types of racism. I will see you there. Thanks for hanging in there with me.